Today's episode is about the economy. This is Ben's main area of expertise, and because of that, he has a lot to say. As much as we tried to condense it, the episode is about 20 minutes long. That being said, I think it's 20 minutes that are well worth your time. It's a great overview of the economy and the government's place in it, and it sums up the most current research on the subject. Having watched this research process from the sidelines, I can attest that to get published, it goes through a rigorous test of critiques and refereeing to assure that the research is sound. Ben will not cite any study that hasn't been through this process. I want to confess that I basically failed the economics portion of my classes in college. I thought I understood the concepts in class, but when it came time to take the test, I realized I had it all backwards in my brain. If you're anything like me, you might be surprised to find that what the research shows helps the economy might be counterintuitive to what you might guess or assume. With that, Ben's topic for today, the economy.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Ramble, a series of videos about the upcoming presidential election and why it makes moral and economic sense to vote for Joe Biden. In today's episode, I want to talk about how the president affects the economy. Now, like I said in the intro video, I have a PhD in economics, so this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I have a lot to say about it. So I'll try to unpack things as carefully as I can and just kind of hit the highlights of things that I think are the most important. And where I want to start is I would like to talk about, how I evaluate the economic policies of a president. What am I really looking for? I'm looking for two things. The first thing that I would like is I would like policies that increase the overall size of the pie, that basically make our economy more efficient and create more wealth for our nation. But I'm also looking for policies that spread that wealth in an even and fair way, that create opportunities and reward hard work. So those are like the dual lenses that I will use to kind of look at a few different policies and think about the economic consequences of those. Now, to keep things organized, I want to divide what I'm going to say kind of into two pieces. I'm going to talk about how a president affects the economy in the short run, and then we'll talk about longer term impacts of the president's policies. So let's start with the short run, and here's the most important thing that I can say about the short run. The president probably matters a lot less than you think for how the economy is affected during his or her term. The US economy is really big, it's really complex, and when a president comes into office, it's got a lot of momentum. And then you think about what policies the president might put in place, it usually takes a year or two or three for those policies to even be created and passed, and then it's going to take another year or two for them to be implemented. And so I rarely really look closely about how the economy performs during a president's term if I'm thinking about whether those policies were good or bad. It just takes too long for those effects to feed through and affect GDP or per capita income or any of these metrics that we might have to measure the effect of those policies. So I would be wary of any president taking credit for economic wins during his first term in office, and I would also be wary of his opponents trying to give him blame for economic losses, because probably those things were not caused by the president. Donald Trump, for example, doesn't have a magic button in the White House that makes the stock market go up or down. While he might try to take credit for the stock market doing relatively well during his presidency, that's really has nothing to do with Donald Trump, I don't think. Now, there is one important exception to that rule that the president doesn't matter in the short run. So, in general, the US economy functions fairly well. The president probably doesn't have to do all that much to let our strong institutions and our strong businesses create jobs and opportunities for a lot of people. However, occasionally the economy is hit by large shocks. Like during my lifetime, I can kind of think of the dot-com bubble, the terrorist attacks on 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, the financial crisis, and coronavirus most recently, all as like very large negative economic shocks that have hit the US economy in various ways. How a president reacts to those shocks really does matter a lot to the US economy, because those are typically fast-moving events that have really large impacts, and we need to react relatively quickly to them. So I want to be clear that Trump was dealt a really tough hand this year with coronavirus. It's not his fault that this virus started to spread, and you look around the world and a lot of economies around the world have not done very well in reaction to it, and public health has not been great. around the world. That being said, I don't think Trump has dealt with coronavirus very well. The US had more advance notice than many other developing countries of how severe this was, and therefore we should have had a better reaction to the virus. So during the first few months of the pandemic, I think Trump spent most of his time downplaying the virus, saying that it's not going to be that bad, that it will go away in April when temperatures warmed up. And now we've moved to this other phase where I feel like Trump is spending most of his time trying to blame other people, blaming China for letting it leave their country, or blaming the World Health Organization. And in fact, he pulled out of the World Health Organization in July at exactly the wrong time. Basically at this time when we need basically all the help we can get, and they need funding from the US to continue fighting the virus. Now, I spent most of the summer researching how coronavirus is affecting the US economy. And from talking to experts across the nation and listening to a lot of conferences and reading a lot of papers, the most consistent message that I've heard, and one that I agree with entirely, is that the best thing we can do for the economy right now is fight the spread of COVID-19. Trump really hasn't done a great job of doing that. What did we need? We needed to increase ventilators and hospital resources early on in the crisis when it was overwhelming our medical system. We needed people to openly and clearly push for masks as it became apparent that masks were really important to wear. And we obviously need to fund a vaccine. And what has Trump done? Well, he's kind of refused to wear a mask, and he has actually tried to reduce funding for creating testing centers. He's tried to reduce funding for the CDC. He's downplayed what Dr. Fauci has said. Sort of all of these things are getting in the way and putting sand in the gears of what we can do to try to fight the spread of the virus, when in fact that's the best thing we can do for the economy and the best thing we can do for public health. So overall, I this one large economic test that Trump has had, and it's a really kind of negative shock, I just don't think he's done well in facing it. And the biggest problem he's had, I don't expect him to be an expert on the economy or an epidemiologist, but I do expect a president to put experts in place and to listen to them. And I think Joe Biden will do that. If you look at his economic plan, the number one bullet point in his plan right now is funnel resources towards fighting the virus. And I'm sure that comes from him listening to experts, to epidemiologists, and to economists who are saying this is the most important thing that we can do. So to recap everything so far, in the short run, the president really doesn't have much effect on the economy, so I wouldn't look too closely at how the economy performs, with the exception of how a president responds to a crisis like coronavirus. And on that front, I just really don't think Trump has handled this recent crisis that well. Let me move now to talking about how a president affects the economy in the long run, because there I do think a president and his policies matter a lot. And that's because these policies tend to be quite sticky. They stay around for a really long time, and that constant pressure on the economy can start to sway things and change how our economy functions. I want to talk about three broad areas that I think are really important areas and are areas of concern for a lot of people. The first thing I'll talk about is free trade. Free trade is basically the idea that we should allow goods and services to flow freely between different countries. Trump is very clearly anti-free trade. He has instituted trade wars against multiple countries, and mostly he's done this by putting tariffs in place. Now, a tariff is just a fee that gets put onto any good as it gets imported into the United States, and it is the foreign producer of that good that has to pay the fee. On their surface, the tariff could seem like a good idea because, what does it do? It generates revenue for the United States, and it potentially protects American businesses from foreign competition. All that sounds great, and I think this is Trump's view of tariffs. But I have honestly never read a single economic paper or textbook that claims that tariffs are good for the US economy. And the reason for that is, if you boil it down and think about what's the main effect of a tariff, what's it going to do? What it will do is it will increase prices of those goods. We could have imported that good for $25, and we put a $5 tariff on it, and now the foreign producer has to raise the price in order to still be profitable. And the US consumers end up paying a huge portion of those tariffs. It increases prices. Or there's another thing that could happen, which is when you impose a tariff, the foreign producer decides not to send the good to the United States at all because they can't be profitable doing that. What do US consumers do when that happens? Well, they have to go find the good somewhere else from someone who either charges a higher price or someone who can't produce the good with as high of quality. So either way, US consumers are hurt by tariffs. And the Congressional Budget Office, which is an independent arm of the US government, a nonpartisan arm, they estimate that Trump's tariffs are affecting about 17% of overall imports to the United States. And the net effect of that is they're decreasing US GDP by about 0.5%. Now, 0.5% doesn't sound like a lot, so let me put that in real terms. It's equivalent to taking away about $1,300 from every US household across the country. That's a large amount of money. That's actually equivalent to the size of the stimulus that went out in the wake of coronavirus, which was about $1,200 for every US household. So if these tariffs stay in place, they're taking $1,300 away from your pocket every single year. So overall, Trump is clearly anti-free trade. Now, where does Joe Biden stand? His past record is kind of mixed, actually. He's voted about half the time in favor of free trade agreements and half the time against. But he has publicly said that he would roll back Trump's trade wars and try to reduce the tariffs that have been put in place. So overall, on free trade, I certainly lean towards Joe Biden being better for the US economy. Let me move to the next topic I want to cover, which is tax policy. Tax policy is a huge issue, and I know it's something that people feel quite strongly about, and that where Republicans and Democrats have been divided for many, many years. A huge piece of Trump's economic policy has been tax cuts, which he instituted in 2017. Now, I've heard people say, I don't really like Trump, but I like what Trump has done for my tax bill. I like what he's done for my wallet. And that's totally understandable. I don't like paying high taxes either. I don't think anyone does like paying taxes. But I was then in 2017 and still am now pretty strongly against these tax cuts. And I'm against them for two reasons. The first reason is the tax cuts are kind of equivalent to taking out a second mortgage on your home and going out and buying a Porsche with that money. Yeah, you feel great driving the Porsche. It feels really good. And that's kind of how we all feel right now with like more money in our pockets because of the tax cuts. But it's not going to feel that great when those bills start to come due. It's important to put in context that these tax cuts happened in 2017 in the middle of the longest economic expansion that, or one of the longest anyway, that the US has ever seen. And if Trump cut taxes and also cut spending at the same time, I could see that potentially being good for the economy, depending on how he cut taxes and how he cut spending. But Trump actually cut taxes and increased spending, which ends up in the US borrowing more and more money. And we're doing that. That's fiscal stimulus. That's what that is. And we're doing it at exactly the time when the economy didn't need stimulus, during an economic expansion. So what does that do? It makes it harder for the country to create stimulus when crises hit, like in the wake of coronavirus. Basically, if you've learned anything about personal finance, we know that you should save during good times so that you have some dry powder, so you have some funds available during bad times. Trump's tax policy did exactly the opposite of that. And this is why I really don't think it's a good idea. Now, I don't want to be a fearmonger. I think, so far we've been able to continue borrowing. We were able to borrow in the wake of coronavirus. But certainly the effect of those tax cuts makes it harder. And eventually, we can't continue borrowing at the rate that we have been. We're at a point now where the U.S. national debt is over 100% of GDP. And if we keep moving on that trajectory, it's just not sustainable in the long run. And so overall, I just really don't think that was a move in the right direction. The second reason why I was against the tax cuts is they mostly went to wealthy individuals. Now, I'm all for rewarding people for hard work. I'm for rewarding people for their talent and their ability and for the economic gains that they create. But at the same time, it's really important to recognize that income and wealth inequality has been increasing in the United States over the past several decades. And I think broadly, the reason for that is there are a few companies that have done really, really well that have been able to take advantage of globalization, and they've been able to grow very successfully. And I think it's absolutely correct to take some of those economic gains and spread them to other hardworking members of our country who haven't been quite so lucky. I really don't think that increasing tax rates on the wealthy is going to decrease their incentives to work by very much at all. And in fact, I personally would vote even to increase my own taxes. Not that I'm super wealthy, but I would be happy to pay higher taxes if it creates more economic opportunity for other hardworking people who haven't been as lucky as I have been. I just think that's the moral thing to do. I think that's actually economically probably better for our country as well. So overall, I really was not a fan of the tax cuts. And I think it's important to recognize that Joe Biden's economic plan would raise taxes on people who are making over $400,000 a year. It's a very small sliver of our economy, and it's largely people who I think have been lucky. Of course, they've worked hard. Of course, they have high talent, and they should be rewarded for that. But they've also had really good fortune and good opportunities, and we need to pass some of those economic gains to people who don't have as much good fortune, and don't have as many economic opportunities. That leads me into my very last topic of social welfare. This is, again, a topic that I think Republicans and Democrats have been divided on for a really long time. And like many of you, I get concerned when I see too many government handouts. I worry about the types of incentives that those handouts create. We worry that those handouts create incentives for people to be lazy, to not be self-reliant, which are values that I think are really important, and obviously they're important for our economy. Those, I think, are concerns, and I think they push us towards we should create social welfare that doesn't diminish those incentives too much. But at the same time, the more I read and the more I've seen of the academic literature, the less concerned I am about that. Of course, handouts increase this moral hazard type of behavior where people are maybe a little bit lazier or less self-reliant. That's definitely true. But the best economic studies that I've read suggest that those increases in moral hazard, those increases in dependence on the government are actually very, very small, while the benefits of social welfare programs are actually quite large. And let me illustrate that with just one example. Think about unemployment insurance. So unemployment insurance, basically what it does is when someone loses their job, the government sends them a check that replaces a certain portion of their income for a certain amount of time. And those amounts have varied depending on who the president is and what Congress decides to do. Now, what the data show is that when unemployment insurance is more generous, people wait longer to find a new job. And that seems like evidence that people are just sort of like taking free checks from the government, being lazy, waiting until those checks run out, and then they go and find a job. And actually, that was the viewpoint of academic economists for several decades. But in 2008, this study came out by one of the most renowned economists in the US, Raj Chetty, that kind of turned that logic around a little bit. He used this really cool data to show that actually a huge reason why people are waiting longer to find a new job is because they're searching for a better job. That actually that increased amount of time that they wait until they get a new job is because they're they're searching to find a job that better matches their skills, that's going to give them higher wages, and from which they're less likely to be fired going forward. All of those things are what we want to promote. And in fact, unemployment insurance is allowing them to do that. If you don't have unemployment insurance, people are sort of forced to take the very first job that they can get because they really need a paycheck. And when they do that, they take lower paying jobs that are less stable, and they end up back in unemployment again or needing other forms of government assistance. So Raj Chetty in this paper, basically, he does this estimation that shows, if anything, the US economy would be better overall by increasing unemployment insurance slightly. Does unemployment insurance create incentives for people to be lazy? Yes, it does. But overall, it actually serves to help people find better jobs and make the economy more vibrant. Now, that's just one example, but there are lots of other examples in other welfare programs, including Medicare and Medicaid, including our bankruptcy system, food stamps, and other areas. In fact, I've studied a lot the bankruptcy system, and I can tell you from looking at literally thousands and hundreds of thousands of bankruptcy filings, there is hardly anyone who's filing for bankruptcy who doesn't need it, who is filing it just because they want to get rid of their debt. And I think that's really true of most social welfare programs. So overall, I think it is really important to design these social welfare programs to try to reduce these negative incentives of relying on the government. By and large, these welfare programs are really good for our economy because what they do is they help people get back on their feet so they can become self-reliant again. And the academic evidence kind of backs this up. So we've covered a lot of ground in this video. Let me just kind of recap what I think are the highlights. In the short run, a president really doesn't affect the economy all that much. And so I wouldn't rely too heavily on looking at exactly what happens to the economy during a president's term. But it does matter a lot how they react to crises. And I really think Donald Trump has not done a good job of listening to experts in the wake of coronavirus. Secondly, presidential policies do matter a lot in the long run. And I think it's really important to recognize that Trump's trade wars are taking around $1,300 out of your pocket every single year, while Joe Biden has said that he would promote free trade. Trump's tax policy has lowered taxes without lowering spending. That's not a conservative fiscal thing to do, and I think that sort of harms our ability to react to financial shocks going forward. And lastly, the academic evidence shows that well-designed social welfare programs are actually good for the economy and good overall, and Joe Biden, I think, would promote most of those types of policies. So I have to come down and say that Joe Biden would be better for the U.S. economy than Donald Trump.